Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And it always feels good to be rooted in community, even when it is virtually. And I'm looking forward to listening to all of you, to learning from you, and to that doing what it has always done for me, which is directly informing how I advocate, and more importantly, now that I'm on the federal level, how I legislate. And it is a very full circle moment that we are having this listening only virtual convening. You may recall, and some of you participated in 2010. We convened the first ever listening only hearing in the history of the Boston City Council. Under the banner of the Standing Policy Committee, I created the Committee on Healthy Women, Families, and Communities, which was the first policy committee on the council to name trauma. And we had that listening only hearing to hear from some almost 400 families who had been impacted directly by homicide. And it is there that I first really began to appreciate what has now become my daily mantra, that the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policy making. And so now I find myself 2 years into my tenure in Congress, and some of the work that I'm proudest of having done in that time has been directly shaped and informed by the Massachusetts 7th, and certainly top of the list of that is our work on trauma together. And I really do mean that, our collective work together on trauma. I convened the first ever hearing on childhood trauma in the Oversight Committee. My forever chairman, Elijah Cummings, made it possible for me to do that. And many members said it was the most impactful hearing that they had participated in some 20 plus years. And several members then went on to have their own town halls in community about trauma, which is something that they had not previously done. And then certainly to now take this to a legislative response, and to introduce this childhood trauma bill, which I'm excited to talk with you more about, because we know that trauma shows up in many ways. There are many iterations of it. It is systemic, which is why it really does demand and require a systemic solution and response. And so earlier this month, I introduced the Strong Support for Children's Act. Now, what this will do is create 2 new public health grants that will help communities address the root causes of childhood trauma by supporting reparative, healing-centered, neighborhood-based, gender-responsive, and culturally trauma-informed approaches. Now, I know we said a lot there, but that's because we have to be holistic and comprehensive. And I should add that those approaches, reparative, healing-centered, neighborhood-based, gender-responsive, culture and trauma-informed, came directly from community. We always have a robust process in the development of any piece of legislation. I consider all of you to be my co-architects in the drafting of legislation. And so that's what we heard, from providers. That's what we heard from families who had been impacted. And so that's why our approach is this way legislatively. So thank you to each and every one of you for inspiring this piece of legislation and showing us that communities know exactly what they need in order to heal. And so all we have to do is create the space and listen, and then respond accordingly. Which is why I'm so grateful to each of you for joining me. I want to continue to learn about ways that we can support you to do this work together, and to uplift one another, and to do the work of preventing and combating trauma, but when it does happen, ensuring that we are doing everything in our power to mitigate it, and again, to break those cycles. So with that, I'd like to begin with introductions, and then I will very informally guide a conversation. Again, we all know each other, so it's new for us to be at a virtual table, but it's not new for us to be at a table together. So let's get into the introductions. And I think we're going to begin with Bethany.
Am I unmuted? Oh, good. It's so wonderful to see you all, especially you, Congresswoman. It's been a while. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to you and Luz and the A-team for your work in really advocating for the most vulnerable, particularly our children. And I also thank you so much for reaching out as you sought to be informed by those closest to the pain. in the development of the Strong Support for Children Act. So my name is Bethany Serota. I am an attorney. I currently serve as the Deputy Director of Programs and Operations for the Office of Workforce Development for the City of Boston. And I formerly was an attorney who represented parents and children in abuse and neglect cases, and also co-direct an empowerment program for teenage girls in Roxbury. And again, thank you so much, Congresswoman, for supporting that initiative back when you were a city councilor at large. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Bethany, for what you continue to do in community, and appreciate your joining us today. Now we'll hear from Charles.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you today, engaging in this important dialogue. My name is Charles Daniels. I'm the co-founder of Followers Uplift Incorporated and a therapist by training, where we're working with followers to help them stay engaged in their kids' life, especially those followers behind bars trying to stay out of getting reincarcerated, but also positively engaged in their kids' lives. I'm looking forward to engaging in the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Charles. Okay, appreciate your being here, and very familiar with your work. So appreciate your lending your expertise to this table. Gladys.
Buenas tardes. My name is Gladys Vega. I am the Executive Director of the Chelsea Collaborative. I'm delighted to be invited by our Congresswoman, Ayanna. Thank you so much for having me in this important conversation. Our nonprofit organization has been key before the pandemic and during the pandemic in addressing the issue of youth and children. Our families are constantly being neglected, and we will continue to work very hard to address all the issues that resurfaced during the pandemic. We have a lot of children going to sleep hungry, a lot of neglected children, a lot of kids that do not have support systems in place for the educational purpose. Although our school system is to helping them and supporting them, it's not enough, as many of the moms don't know how to support them in their own language. So it creates a very critical dilemma in terms of moms feeling hopeless when it comes to in-house schooling. So we are trying to figure out a way to support those families that way, in addition to providing financial resources, food, and everything that has been brought about within the pandemic.
Thank you, Gladys. And you are on the right path, because that's exactly some of what we want to unpack at this virtual table today. You know, in my time on the council, I think I convened 7 or 8 hearings on trauma, looking at the different forms of it. And when we did see some more resources dedicated and a greater awareness of trauma, when I first started speaking about trauma, many people would ask me to define what it was. I remember being in a conversation specifically about how to combat educational inequities and the achievement gap. And people said, what are you going to do about the achievement gap? And I said, we're going to address trauma because it is a barrier to learning. And it's hard to believe that that was in 2009. And many people were cynical, skeptical, just unaware that that was even true. And of course, to your point, Gladys, and we'll unpack this more in the roundtable, trauma already existed because of poverty and food insecurity and homelessness and violence in every form, from gun violence to domestic violence, fear of deportation, again, gentrification, displacement. So, you know, our children in particular have already been carrying a lot in their sort of emotional backpacks, if you will, across the thresholds into our schools when they could safely learn in school. But we know that trauma is not exclusive to our children. You know, everyone is experiencing trauma. That was always true, but it certainly has been more true the last 4 years. So thank you for raising those issues. We'll unpack those things, further in this meeting. But given the growing trauma because of the impacts of the pandemic, that's also why this is a very timely conversation. So thank you again, Gladys. And now we'll hear from Linda. And then after Linda, we'll hear from Jermaine.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for having me today. I'm honored to be here with all of you here today, so thank you. My name is Linda Tang, and I'm currently working as a school-based outpatient clinician, providing individual therapy to high school students in BPS, working for one of the oldest Black-operated nonprofit organizations and that provide behavioral health and wraparound services, primarily to children, youth, and families of color. Prior to my transition to outpatient services, I was providing in-home therapy to youth and families and also a former educator. So when I was looking for an organization to work with, I really wanted to serve in my own community, location-wise. So shout out to Grove Hall. So I also wanted it to reflect the structural inequities that I grew up in. So I was born and raised in Brockton, Massachusetts, and I experienced a lot of community violence, trauma, other adversities as a first-generation Chinese American to immigrant parents. So growing up in these environments was so important for me to become the person that I never had and support people of color with access to services and resources that I never even knew that were available when I was younger. So as I continued to build my experience in social work, I found it very important that I remain authentic to myself while providing evidence-based therapies to the folks in my community. And now I'm also working in partnership with an organization in Oakland that provides hip hop therapy groups for transitional aged youths, which allows me to integrate music, art, and therapy to encourage young people to find their own voice and tap into their own skills for creating their own narrative and expressive healing and development. So thank you for having me here today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to get into it, and I love what you said about you wanted to, be and provide to youth what you didn't have. And I also really appreciate your centering, and Gladys did this a little bit as well, but you did it that much more pointedly, the immigrant experience. A lot of the work that I've been doing so far is dismantling school to confinement pathways through my bills like ending the Push Out Act and counseling, not criminalization. We find that Black and Brown youth and immigrant youth and those with disabilities disproportionately are suspended, disciplined, and expelled. And we certainly do think a lot of that has to do with not only embedded biases, but that many children are traumatized, and that is why it's important that we have a trauma-informed learning environment, and again that everyone in the learning community has the skills and the tools and the prompts to then ask a child not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you, right? And so as we talk about the ACEs and having that fluency and command of those things. And so anyway, I appreciate you're saying you seek to be that which you did not have. And as I said a moment ago, we know that trauma does not discriminate. It is certainly not limited to our children. That's the emphasis of this bill in our discussion today. But the reason why we're focused there is because I do believe that broken children do have an increased likelihood of growing up to be broken adults. And that means you cannot bring to bear your full contributions and gifts to community and to society. So, okay. And now we're going to hear from Jermaine and then Keon.
Good afternoon. My name is Jermaine Taylor. I'm inner city weightlifting member services coordinator / personal trainer / orator. What we do here at Inner City Weightlifting, or ICW for short, is we work with the lost, forgotten population, basically the high at-risk kids who are most likely to reoffend, who pretty much are written off by society for the most part. And our ploy it involves weight training and having them obtain their personal training certification, but that's just the pitch. When they get in here, there's so much life structure that we provide beyond just weight training, beyond the anatomy, from emotional support to mental, so on and so forth. I could also re-express some of the same sentiments that Linda had. Like I this place and the things that I do here, just in life period, but also with inner city, there's a sense of purpose behind providing the youth with what I didn't have and what I lacked. And that's kind of what I'm in here for. So I'd be happy to articulate a lot of, the past experience that I have. And I'm pretty sure Keon could attest to this as well, that there's value in our experience, being able to articulate our experience and being able to bridge this gap, so to speak, between two sides. And, it's almost commoditized nowadays. And if we realize the value of it, then we have a responsibility, and the job is just beginning. And I'm ready to dive in.
Absolutely. And again, this is trauma is pervasive, it is systemic. It requires systemic solutions and also systemic investments, which is why I'm so focused on this on the federal level, because so many of you are doing good work. There are so many proven models. I've had the opportunity to meet many of the young people that have come out on the other side of inner city weightlifting. And I was saying to Luz the other day that an activist had reminded me that self-esteem is earned through esteemable acts. And that is certainly evidenced by the model that is inner city weightlifting. And that self-esteem is important in self-determination and self-agency, and again, bringing to bear your gifts and your contributions. So thank you for everything you do and for joining us here today. Okay, and then now, who's next in line? Who's next in the queue here? That last one, no.
Can you hear me?
Okay, here we go. Here you go, now I see you. All right.
Congresswoman.
Thank you, Keon. Thank you.
My name's Keon Sprinkle, for the people who don't know me. I uniquely enough had the opportunity to meet the Congresswoman and some of the other people that she worked with. I'm a member of the AACC and AHC, which is an in-prison group that we created. The purpose is to try to get the youth together in the prison and the elders to kind of bridge the gap. And then from there, we transformed to trying to reach out to people outside of the prison to show what our value was and how we can contribute to helping get rid of a lot of the problems that's happening, because a lot of people that are in charge at the time really didn't have the air of the youth as we did. And they wasn't dealing with them as, close as we was. So I still consider myself being a member of that. And I've been out 8 months now after, being exonerated, after staying in prison for 21 years almost for something that I didn't do. Uniquely enough, my daughter kind of inspired me too when it comes to the Congresswoman, because my daughter had a conversation with some other kids in school, a little younger than her, or at after school program, and they was talking about why was everyone happy about the Congresswoman being where she was at. And it inspired my daughters to make a song about the Congresswoman so that they can, educate the youth and the people that was around them about why she was important to them. So when I heard the song, I said, wow, and I actually got to listen to this woman speaking things. So they was spot on, they taught a lot. So I'm just here to give my experience and the trauma that I've been through, having to be raised by my grandparent, like so many people in my generation, etc. Thank you.
Keon, are you trying to make me cry? First of all, welcome home, family. We are so glad that you are here.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Really glad you're here and making good on everything you said you would do. So appreciate you.
Appreciate you.
Whew. Okay, Ruth.
So hi everyone. Hi Ayanna. So good to see you.
So good to see you.
And thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Luz. It's an honor to be amongst everyone on this call. That last brother kind of like.
I'm telling you, he wasn't right for that. Oh my goodness.
So, and I just want to say thank you, Ayanna. I haven't seen you personally in a while. Just like I've just been honored to be in present of everything you've been doing for our community, for all our children, and especially our little girls. And I just want to thank you. I see you. I don't see you in person, but I see you and you're doing it. And I just appreciate you. So thank you.
And we thank you. As I said, in my travels, that we have our own mothers of the movement. And, speaking of bridging, I just so appreciate what you've done to make sure that people understand that, when there is gun violence, that we lose. Society suffers on every side of this. The perpetrator's family, the victim, and if we're going to really break intergenerational trauma and cycles of violence, we have to make sure that those families are not carrying shame and stigma, and that they have the opportunity to be a part of the solutions, but they have a right to their own healing too. And so, thank you, because you were, as they say, the canary in the coal mine, like a lone voice that was making that case, and you and Azara Mendez and Tina Cherry. I mean, you guys, so far as I'm concerned, you are the mothers of the movement here. So thank you. Thank you for being here, for everything you've done.
Thank you. So my name is Ruth Rollins. I am the founder of We Are Better Together, Warren Daniel Hairston Project, that was named after my son. The program, our mission is to connect, prevent, and heal women and girls that are affected by violence and incarceration. We just came up with a new mission, so instead kind of like to prevent the cycle of violence and victimization. So my personal experience, the mission was created based on my personal experience. I have 2 children. My son, Warren Daniel Hairston, was murdered in 2007 to an unsolved homicide. And I know Ayanna personally because I am credited as a co-founder of Operation Lipstick. I wanted to know how the guns are ending up in our community. And through Operation Lipstick, we found out one of the ways was straw buying. But even with all that work that I was doing, I was suffering in silence because I had another child that was incarcerated due to gun violence. And I credit Operation Lipstick for my healing journey because it was that workshop that I started talking about my other son that was incarcerated due to someone losing their life. So I believe, I do believe in accountability, but I believe what we do to one side, we have to do to another to interrupt that cycle of violence. And as we do that, and even as a community, a lot of this community violence is generational. And I believe that if we lift that mother up and if we support that person, that we can interrupt the cycle of violence for their children. So I definitely believe in accountability, but I also believe in that, that nobody's left behind, that we support each person, by us, for us. So it's an honor to be here, and this conversation that we're having is just huge, because I think a lot of the people on this call, we've created what we need for us, by us, for our community, especially for our little people. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. What I so appreciate, Ruth, about you, and you've been an inspiration to so many people in this way. And certainly what we seek to model in our organization is that, we want survivors to be empowered. And so often survivors of, those reentering from incarceration or survivors of violence in all its forms, and as someone who's a survivor of trauma myself, I felt that there were a lot of vehicles and mediums that were exploiting survivors and weaponizing our trauma. Right. And you should not have to weaponize your trauma in order to get the services that you need, in order to be seen, and in order to be a part of developing the solutions and then playing a role in their implementation. So that's really what I love about this, is that each of you are just demonstrating how much you have to contribute and how much we have to learn from you. So now let's get into the more formal but informal conversation. I want to begin by just acknowledging our current context and where we find ourselves in the midst of this global pandemic and unprecedented economic hardship because of unprecedented unemployment and food insecurity. Many families on the precipice of eviction. And again, I represent the Massachusetts 7th. So this is the district that is 53% people of color, 40% foreign born, almost 40% single female headed households, one of the most unequal districts in the country. That was true before COVID. That was true before the current federal administration. But certainly those inequities and disparities and that hurt has only been deepened by this administration and by this pandemic. And so I want to hear from you within the context of COVID. Can you all just offer, what are you seeing? What is the impact on our children? What early trends have you seen? Well, we're 8 months in, but what trends have you seen? What are you hearing over and over again in terms of what is causing potentially not only short-term, but long-term trauma for our youth and their families? And then from your vantage point, what do you think we can do? What can we begin doing now to mitigate the harm later? And so I won't call on people unless you all pretend to be shy, because press is on the line. So, please do just weigh in.
So I'll begin, because as you all were speaking, I kept thinking of the faces of the different families that we've been helping. But one in particular case is the case of an 11-year-old undocumented immigrant who we were told that she was taking care of her 9-month-old brother while the mom was in the hospital with COVID-19. The mother wasn't feeling well. She went to an appointment.
Oh.
She was, they kept her in the hospital. The mother had to be intubated while the daughter was left in the house babysitting her 9-month with no support systems at all, by herself in this apartment at the peak of the pandemic. When we heard about the case, we immediately dropped everything that we were doing, left people here in charge of distributing the food. We ran with my niece and I ran to this house in Central Avenue. This young little girl comes and opens the door with a baby with rather than diapers, she had a towel with safety pins around him because she ran out of diapers. She had no money. She had no contact with any adults other than her and the baby and other people that lived inside that apartment, but they were roommates, different families. I think it were 3 families renting a 3-bedroom apartment. Her mom was renting one of those rooms. And when we knocked on the door, just to say, we're from the Chelsea Collaborative, is there anything we can do? We're non-judgmental. We are here to support you. What can we do? She's like, oh, my mom is in the room. She didn't want to tell us the story until we said, have you eaten? Have you had food? Can we bring you diapers? Can I bring you food? And she immediately, her eyes lit up. And it was the saddest thing for seeing an 11-year-old taking care of a 9-month with no resources. So we immediately told her that we were there to support her. We ran back to the collaborative. We continued to send food to her. We continued to stay in touch. We gave her diapers. Every 2 days we would call, is everything okay? And we fed her for 2 weeks, and we did groceries for her for 2 weeks until her mom came out of the hospital. But I know that that story duplicates throughout our community before the pandemic and making it much worse now in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I know that there's a lot of children that are not able to survive the trauma that they're experiencing now when parents or moms, single moms, are so afraid of the evictions. We have approximately over 4,000 database lists of females that are females. The majority of Chelsea's head of households are females. If I was to take a look at that list that Norielis has in a database, I bet you anything, by far, the majority are females, head of household. Right, Norielis? Yes, so Norielis is right next to me, she's agreeing. So that means that the trauma of these families getting the eviction notice and these children hearing that with limited food because they're still hybrid from, in-house being taught. So there's no resources, and the thought that we don't have enough counseling, enough support system for them is devastating. But also the fear of a presidential candidate or an administration that continues to punish undocumented children as if they were to blame for the crisis of humanity. So how inhumane it is that we have these children in cages. Then when we finally have them come out, like this young girl, she was on an accompanied minor. She comes here and she sees the poverty that her mom lives in. And this is what she's faced with. And her story repeats over and over. So I think that the stuff that you're trying to do, Ayanna, in bringing more support system and resources for children that usually are to blame for decisions that we don't have in terms of policies. So I really think that we need to figure out ways in which we support our families and our children, and think about constantly about ways that we can mentor and like not adopt like legally, but keep an eye on these families and these youth so that they have support systems in place as they continue to grow in this level of poverty that I cannot imagine how it would be like in a couple of months. I cannot imagine the city of Chelsea right now with all these evictions knocking on our door. The tsunami of eviction continues to hit us real hard, and we're living it through the children, we're living it through the families, we're seeing it in our community.
Gladys, let me ask you a question. First of all, I mean, it's just, it's devastating. And it's just devastating. It's unconscionable on every level. I wanted to know how you were made aware of her. So when you talk about, two questions. One, how are you aware of the vulnerabilities people are experiencing? They're just coming to the door. How did you know about that young girl specifically? And then so far as what we can do on the federal level to be responsive, I mean, I've been fighting for stimulus and direct reoccurring cash payments, eviction and foreclosure moratoriums, canceling of rent and mortgage. But if we can't get that, federal fund for rental assistance, what other things could we be providing that would make the work that you do easier and support these families in the long term? Excuse me. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I would say, so the way that we found about it, as we were doing at the peak of the pandemic, when Chelsea was the epicenter of the pandemic, we were distributing boxes of food. As we were distributing boxes of food, we were asking people how they're doing, have they been exposed to a person? And that as we were asking those questions and asking people to wear masks and social distancing while there were, 3,000 people waiting for food in our food lines, we would do it. We were doing those self-awareness check. And that's how a lady said, my second floor neighbor was admitted in the hospital. I know that the young girl is not speaking out or seeking help, but she's traumatized inside her house with a 9-month baby that she has to take care of. And that's how we dropped everything we were doing, left our volunteers and the rest of the staff, and we knock on her door. And then, like I said, when we mentioned some of the resources, the small resources that we were offering, her lights, her eyes lit up, and you can tell that the excuse that mom is in her bedroom was no longer an excuse, and she opened up. So I think that the fact that we have people that are able to make people comfortable.
Yeah, you guys are trusted voices.
Yes.
They know you by name. You have the respect and the trust of the community. So that's why it's important that federally that we are investing in trusted voices and organizations that are proven. The other thing that we continue to fight for is to make sure that as we make those funds available, that they're flexible in how you use them. Because I know sometimes the criteria whereby you have to apply those funds is not meeting the diversity of need within community. Would you say that, and then I want to move on, I think Ruth had her hand raised. Would you say that the most pressing issue, the two most pressing issues are food insecurity and housing?
Correct.
Is that what okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Gladys. Ruth, did you have your hand raised?
And thank you for all you're doing, because you name what we need in terms of resources.
I want to piggyback off of that. Ayanna. So one of the biggest challenges that we see, and I was talking to Tina Cherry around this, but this is huge. We don't work with communities that are impacted. There's nothing in place that for housing that are people that are impacted by community violence. This is a big issue that we're having in our community. as domestic violence, we have Jane Doe, we have all these agencies in place that to have people move. But when we talk about community violence, there's nothing in place or policy in place on how we're treating these families. Nobody raises a murderer, but it's a lot of cases that families, children that might have caused harm, that they're left in the home and the children are re-traumatized. There's nowhere to go. There's no services that support them right away. So like, you know, we've been strategic with helping with emergency moves and supporting them, but we keep running into roadblocks when it comes to working with families that are impacted by community harm. That's one of our challenges. And then we dealing with a lot of these grandmothers that they are the primary caretaker because their loved one is incarcerated, their daughter or their son. And they're experiencing, you know, like grief, really, really bad grief, you know, food insecurities, like, you know, struggling with keeping the children from not acting out and going in the street, which would cause some of the shootings that's happening. So, you know, those are some of the things that we've seen.
I appreciate that. So first, I just want to say to Gladys, please eat, okay? Everyone, I know don't worry about being on video. I saw Gladys was starting to eat and then she saw she was on video and she stopped. Listen, I know that all of you have little opportunity to actually nourish yourself because you're taking care of everyone else. So yes, hydrate. Thank you, Ruth. And Gladys, you eat your meal, okay? Everyone else do the same. Ruth, so two quick things on that. One, I have introduced a legislation with Jim McGovern, who serves in this delegation as well, who you all may know does incredible work on food insecurity, but we've partnered on how to better support grand families. So those children that are being raised by grandparents, which has been a growing family model for the last decade, not only because of military service and poverty, but because of mass incarceration and also substance use disorder. And so here you have people who've already raised their children, many of them with underlying health conditions, on fixed incomes, and they're not even going through a formal process of kinship care. They're just taking on this additional responsibility with no additional resourcing. So we did introduce the Grand Family, I think it's the Housing Act. My LD Ais is on here and she'll correct me in the chat, right? And that is specifically to provide funds through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, to prioritize housing for grand families. So it's very targeted. And I raise that because we know, to your point, Ruth, none of this stuff happens in a silo. It's all interconnected. And so housing is a critical determinant of everything, the trajectory of your life, public health. If you're destabilized in that way, you'll be destabilized in other ways. So I appreciate you raising some of the very unique stressors for our grand families. And just know that that is something that we're focused on legislatively and in terms of a federal investment. To your point around emergency housing, I can't tell you, and Luz could speak to this more effectively, how many families have contacted us who saw their loved one murdered in front of them, and they are desperate to relocate because it is re-traumatizing every time they have to enter their home. And it just seems that all that we're told that we can do is get them on a list. And so since you have worked on the provider aspect of this, and you've been on the impacted aspect of this, what would help us to streamline that process? Because right now it just seems we pick up the phone, we call someone, call an agency, they put you on a list, and then we just have to keep calling to advocate for that family to be moved up on a list. It seems like they're trying to balance DV survivors and then other forms of trauma, and then they have to create some very unjust hierarchy of what form of violence or what trauma it should take precedent. That's what my experience has been, but I'd love to hear from you. Also, folks, please pay attention in the chat, because we are putting links in there about legislation and resources and things like that. So just make sure that you're following that as well. And you can drop stuff in there too, okay? So, but could you just speak to me about that, the emergency, like what would be the loophole we need to fix or we need to address to provide emergency housing for those impacted by community-based violence?
So first, I think it is gonna have to start with policy. So, you know, I wear two hats. So I do the domestic violence work as well. And it's very disheartening. It's very discouraging how when we work with DV, it's a whole different criteria, a whole different priority and things you can get. But when we talk about community violence, the services aren't there in place. So if I'm thinking long-term, even if we had 50 Section 8, so 50 emergency housings to move, or you know, like at our agency, we help with a realtor. There's nothing in place. We don't have anything that's families that are impacted by community violence. First, I believe it's going to have to start with policy, because it seems to be an ongoing issue, and they may get priority with Boston Housing, but what does priority means? That you're no longer waiting 20 years, but you're waiting 8 years.
That's
but 9
right.
out of 10, you need emergency.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is we can't be generalist in our approach. We have to be very specific and targeted. So maybe if we were able to, if it were an investment of funding for a dedicated liaison for families impacted by community-based violence, and then set aside housing. Right. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay.
And a start, because we're not gonna, you know, unfortunately murders and, you know, happen in our community, or violence. I mean, and we won't be able to fix all, but it'll be a start. We have nothing as of now. Depending on whether it's the DA or the Peace Institute, my agency, we have nothing in place. You have to be strategic. And if you're new to this, you'll be lost. Like, you know, like you won't know how to navigate through the system, because there's nothing in place for people being impacted by community violence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. Excellent point. And before we go on, I'm going to do two things. I want to introduce my sister in service, Counselor Meja, who I know has joined us, and I know how hard she works and how dedicated she is to advocating and creating safer, healthier communities for her constituents. And prior to her election to the council, that was actually how we first met, because we both were in a lot of church basements and at community meetings in her capacity with Determined Divas and the Family Independence Initiative, and the work she was doing around combating trauma in our schools. So this is a space that she has fluency in. We're grateful for her leadership and the voice that she brings to these issues on the council. So Councilor Meja, if you want to offer a few words, and then I'm going to step away to the restroom for 1 minute. So after Councilor Meja, let's see, did anyone else have a hand raised that wants to comment? Okay, so we'll go to Linda after Councilor Meja, okay? And I'll be right back. Thanks, everyone.
I just wanted to say hello. I don't have much to say, surprisingly enough. I'm just happy to be in community with so many people who I know, who I've worked with, who I've been out in these trenches with, doing the work every single day. So I'm here to listen and learn and be in community with you all to inform whatever work that I need to do on the municipal level. So I'm here for all of it. And so just here to listen and learn and be with y'all. And thank you for giving me a space. I learned from the best. So I'm gonna fall back and listen.
Thank you, Counselor. Okay, Linda.
So the COVID-19 crisis is also a mental health crisis too, right? So I'm seeing a higher need for behavioral health and mental health, because I'm seeing a lot of youths who are having challenges with managing depressive symptoms, anxiety, social anxiety, trauma, interpersonal and social skills. And some youths may be living in a home or environment that they could be experiencing DV as well. So in addition to that, folks are at risk for eviction, like we were talking about earlier, and there's high levels of homelessness and poverty. So I think COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities, which is causing high rates of loss and grief as well. So with the increased barriers, like the lack of resources and services, there's just a lot of higher rates of toxic stress, cortisol levels, and things like that. So with the mental health crisis, there's a physical health crisis too, right? So it's like, you know, the accessibility to healthy foods, or even medical care or physical activity, simple things like that. That's definitely affecting many of the youths that we are working with now. In addition to the viral pandemic, there's a racial pandemic that's been going on for hundreds of years as well. So navigating through all of that all at once, it's going to affect an individual. So, you know, I think it's been difficult for youth to connect with their peers physically or virtually for collective healing. And so it looks a little different now, but I believe it's really important for us to be really intentional and creative of how we connect with one another and avoiding isolation during these times. So pandemic on top of pandemic on top of pandemic, there's mental, physical, all of that. That's
Linda,
on.
let me ask you, thank you for that. Let me ask you, how are you connecting with the young people that you work with? So the fact that you know that they are, that, you know, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, mental health challenges are through the roof. How are you getting this feedback? And then what would those resources look like remotely? You know, because until we get this pandemic under control and until the federal level has been able to move the funds so that our schools can safely reopen, we know our young people will be remotely learning. And so how do we ensure that while they are experiencing that social isolation, that we're able to still get those social emotional wraparound and wellness supports to them? Is it telehealth? Is it video conferencing? What does it look like? So.
Yeah, so I'm connecting with the youth through referrals. So I'm actually working with them. So I'm providing clinical services to them. I'm also school-based, so I'm working with a lot of youths who are in BPS. In addition to the hip hop therapy groups that I was talking about, that's also school-based. So I'm connecting with the youth a lot through providing services to them and understanding what diagnoses are, or even just recognizing those symptoms within
So
them.
how do you provide those services remotely? Are you being in community? So the referrals are coming from clinicians, educators, other agencies, and then how do you actually provide the service once there's a diagnosis?
Yep, so I'm providing services through telehealth, through Zoom. And so I'm providing individual and group therapy through Zoom. So we have to be very creative in that sense. And I'm a clinician that really works youth-centered. So, you know, I'm getting to know the youth, and then if they're into a webcomic or if they're into a certain artist that they like, I really try to connect with them, and I would share my screen, or, you know, I would engage them with creating coping tools.
Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful. And just so you guys know, what I'm listening for is, again, systemic problems require systemic solutions. Trauma is pervasive. We know it's being compounded by this unprecedented 3 pandemics in our country right now. And so, you know, I'm just thinking about policy and federal investment. So when I'm listening to you, I know that, okay, I have to make sure that telehealth is not compromised in any way. We have to continue to fight for infrastructure investments, because just like with learning, if you can give a kid a Chromebook, but they don't have a hotspot, it doesn't mean anything. So the fact that you're offering that young people are accessing these services through referrals, and that you were doing that through video conferencing or telehealth, says to me we have to make sure that that is not compromised in any way. So that is that's tremendously helpful. I think Charles had his hand raised to speak.
Yes, Congresswoman, yes, definitely would love to chime in here. There's 2 things that we're seeing. You know, I was speaking to one of our youth. So we also provide therapy to fathers that are trying to stay engaged in their kids' lives, but we also provide therapy to our youth who are growing up in households without their fathers. And one of our youth, an African-American male who's 16 years old, pulled me aside one day and said, Charles, you know, one of my friends, he's white, he came to me and we had a conversation. And he says, you know, I told him, you know, if I had a chance to be white, I would take it. And what he meant by that, and I asked him a little bit more to elaborate on it. He says, you know, Charles, there's so much stress that's connected to being a Black man in America that is unbearable, and I can't deal with it. And oftentimes I don't really have healthy and creative spaces to talk about what does it mean to be Black, right? He said, Charles, even on my way to therapy, sometimes I get pulled over by the police officer, but I'm on my way to therapy, right? So there's 2 things here. I think there is a great opportunity to really engage our youth and dialogue around how does it feel to be Black, the trauma that's connected to being Black. I was raised in a household by my mother and my auntie dying in Washington. And I realized that being Black, there was trauma connected to it at the age of 6 years old when we were pulled over by a white police officer who spat on my mother and pulled out his dog. And his dog was barking at me at the age of 6 years old. And oftentimes there's a lot of trauma associated to being a Black child, a Black boy, a Black girl that isn't dealt with. And I think oftentimes in schools, there really isn't an opportunity to talk about these things. So I think more opportunities, more funding could be geared towards giving our youth an opportunity to engage in this dialogue around being Black in America and the trauma that's connected to it. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, you know, my fathers have brought this to my attention as well as a youth. They said, Charles, who do we call on the police? You know, there's these accountability measures for a lot of people, but we don't really know who do we report police officers that are treating us bad to, right? Do I call the police on the police? Who do I call? Like, what is their accountability measure right there? So I think a part of trauma is you've been able to vocalize your point and your experiences, but also hold people accountable if you feel as if they've contributed to your trauma. And I really believe in the method that was used in Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide, the Truth and Healing Commissions, where there's been opportunities for individuals to share with those individuals who harmed them in some way, form, or fashion. That may be our opportunity here in our country to really create commissions for individuals who have been impacted by police brutality and violence to have a conversation with people in power who are connected to the police department and what have you. Last but not least, one thing that I've noticed for a lot of smaller organizations, my size and also smaller, is that funding opportunities that come down the pipe from the federal government or the state government are out of reach, simply because they can't keep up with the reporting procedures as well as the application requirements, right? I mean, the difficulty that it takes to write an application that meets federal requirements, federal obligations, as well as to keep up with the data collection process. I really believe that if this is going to work, or any type of funding that's geared towards healing, racial trauma, whatever the case may be, there has to be opportunities or webinars or technical support available to smaller organizations to be able to.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much for making that point, because I know this has been a source of great frustration for my colleagues on the Congressional Black Caucus, who have been, you know, very pointed and very fierce in their advocacy for a long time and fighting for targeted specific grants, and the folks that are in the greatest need for them don't know how to access them. Mm-hmm. And so we do need to be instructive about that. And then also whatever federal investments we need to make about staff capacity and things like that. I so appreciate your transparency about that, because, you know, very often we can design something on paper that is well-meaning, but in real time and in real life is not accessible and is laborious and is a very onerous process. And so thank you for being transparent about that. And also I appreciate your naming racial trauma. I hope that while we're in the midst of this national reckoning on racial injustice, that we will make strides there. I know Congresswoman Barbara Lee out of California has actually introduced something federally, to your point, around truth and reconciliation. You know, I think it's long overdue. So, and I did also want to add, and Aissa can drop into the chat, I did introduce a bill with Senator Warren and Representative Barbara Lee, the Anti-Racism and Public Health Act, which just acknowledges that, you know, things like police brutality, that's the 6th leading cause of death amongst Black men. So racism is a public health crisis, right? The coronavirus is disproportionately hitting, you know, Black and brown communities. It is now the 3rd leading cause of death amongst Black Americans. So again, very trying times. I do hope this is a moment of reckoning, and that we will be actively anti-racist in all of our policies to address these things. But thank you for sharing your own story too. But just for naming racial trauma, because so far we've just been talking about it within the context of social determinants or hurtful policies. So it's so important that you name that specifically. So we have about 20 more minutes. So I want to get in as many voices as I can, because we've talked about our strong act, but there will be more bills to come. So what we're hearing from you is directly informing, you know, where we need to go. My first question prompt was around COVID and being specific to what you all are seeing, what trends, what can we do to mitigate that? And so now, where I'd like to transition the conversation into, we've already gotten into some of it, structural inequities, how does that show up? And that includes, everything from our foster system to ICE to mass incarceration. So I would, love to hear from folks about that. And then, community-based solutions, because that's really one of the guiding principles of our Strong Support for Children Act. And then, so if you guys want to take notes, because I want you guys to be able to hit all of this, and then cultural competency. Okay, so what does that look like? What does a culturally competent path forward look like that includes language justice and, again, cultural humility and competency? So those are the things I'd like for folks to touch on: cultural competency, community-based solutions, structural inequities, if you can name those things. And I said I wasn't going to call anybody, but I do want to make sure that we are getting Keon and everyone else in this conversation here. So let me see where you're.
I'm sorry, Counselor.
Yes. Oh, did you have something, Counselor Meja?
I have to leave really. I have a hearing that starts at 4, but I want to say something. I just wanted to say something really quick in regards to a lot of the mental health and wellness issues that I'm seeing bubbling up to the top as a result of remote learning. There, we've seen some spikes in suicide temptations around some of our most vulnerable students. And so I think really looking at suicide and the intersection of like how remote learning is impacting our kids is really something that we may want to explore a little bit further. And then in terms of language access, one of the things that I've noticed as a result of COVID is that we need to, when we talk about cultural competency, we need to be able to speak in ways that people understand, like all of this social distancing and flattening the curve. Nobody speaks like that. I had to Google half of those things. Is that if we're really serious about educating and engaging people, we need to speak in the most basic terms so that people can access the information. And then the last thing I'm going to say around language access and information justice, really is the way I see it, is that we have a large segment of the population of folks who are illiterate. And even if they know, even if it's not about language interpretation and translation, my mom did not even finish the 4th grade. And so she struggles to even read and write in her own native language. And we have to be really intentional about how we're communicating with people in ways that they can actually understand. So utilizing more video and audio as a way to engage folks and not just relying on interpretation and translation, I think are things.
Excellent. That is an excellent point. And I love what you said, information justice, because ultimately that's really what we're trying to get at, is empowering people with the information. So information justice, I love that. And to your point, devastatingly so, on the increase in attempted suicides. I know Luz certainly has received a number of calls, given the role that she plays in our office. And so we are paying attention to that. And sadly, that is one of the ways that childhood trauma is really showing up and manifesting. So I do want to hear from Jermaine and Keon. Do you guys want to get in here in this conversation? Anything you want to, what's on your mind?
Yeah. Let me get a little closer. I get a little closer. Lou said she can't hear me. So yeah, I've actually had the luxury of lately of communicating back and forth with Lou in regards to a particular structural inequity in regards to prison sentencing, and mandatory prison sentencing, and how I can say from experience, I did a 3-year upstate sentence for possession of a firearm. I had to do this time day for day, like every single day. There were programs available, like self-help programs available, like mental health programs, anger management, things like of that nature, but they were not incentivized in any form or fashion. Now, before we get into the argument of accommodating an inmate and incentivizing stuff, I rest my laurels on you need incentivism for just about like anything. And if we can take guys with their other crimes and with partner their rehabilitation with the incentive of receiving some type of good time of some sort, why would people that fall in my category, if I get caught with a gun, why wouldn't I be incentivized the same way? I'm being sent home with no rehabilitation, honestly. I'm still angry. I still have to keep a gun on me respectively because of my lifestyle in the area that I live in, and so on and so forth. What changed? The only thing that changed is I'm eligible now to receive even more time the next time I get caught with a firearm that I have to do day for day. That to me is a structural inequity. I feel like I feel like there's not enough light shed on the violent offenders. I feel like they're kind of just tossed away and you know, they do their time and they come home. When you have a mandatory sentence, it's like there's no light at the end of the tunnel until that time is upon you. There's nothing like to work for. It's not like an uphill climb that you're working for. I've also done time. I've done 8 years federally. The Fed gave me 15% of my good time. Oh, excuse me, 85% of my good time. It was like they give it to you initially as soon as you walk in. So my 8-year sentence got knocked down to like a 6-year sentence. And when you commit any type of rule infractions, you forfeit the good time that they give you. But I know that system, it resulted in the institution being ran a lot more orderly based off of what I've seen because it was incentivized. And universally, everyone in the federal jail got the good time. But then when I go upstate, and I'm seeing like this is more personal now because these are the youth that are from my neighborhood that I see and I watch. And it's like they're so lost and they have no real reason. They'd have like all right, I'm in jail. Like all right, I'm not going in that group. I'm not getting out no earlier. I don't get parole. I don't care.
I got it.
That's
I appreciate.
That's what we're dealing with.
No, I appreciate your bringing that to the discussion because, 90% of folks are going to re-enter, they're going to come back into society and community, and they'll come into structural inequities. And so, one, it's traumatic to be navigating that behind the wall and then to re-enter into society and then be navigating that. But how do we best position folks? And to that point about that trauma, and you said, what has changed, what's different? I'm just curious, everyone stands to benefit from a healing journey. And, did you go on one? And how were you able, did you ever acknowledge to yourself that you had experienced trauma, whether it was policy violence or destabilizing factors in your household, or while incarcerated? And how were you able to, or did you ever access supportive resources, and what did that look like? What should it look like?
So I would say yes. I did find supportive resources, but not in the conventional methods that one might suggest you do so. I learned how to be a man in jail, as crazy as this sounds. I went in at 19, I came home like in my 30s for the most part. And it's like, Keon was my cellmate about a whole year. You think you're gonna be that in the cell with that guy and not walk out any better? I highly doubt it, And being with him, like for example, it helps. Being around people like him and him kind of made me more aware of my worth. But I was so fortunate. That's not something that you can like take out of a text and like apply like that. This is something more case by case. And I was very fortunate to I had a very solid group of guys around me that consistently reminded me of everything that I have to bring to the table. Back to what Linda was saying about being able to provide the things that we never had. I never had that. I don't want my guys to have to go do 8 years to get that, like it's behind the wall.
Right.
And get desensitized to humanity and then have to reestablish their sensitivity and reestablish their feelings. And that is very unrealistic of an expectation to hold on our youth. I don't know. I'll end with that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, you're up, sir.
All right. So in the process of everybody talking, like a billion things went through my mind all at once, right? So I guess I'll start with the most recent, in Jermaine's circumstance. like I was telling you, what our program had represented was I seen a guy that came in, he was smart, you know, and anytime you come into any new prison, guys want to know what area you came from, different things like that. And, you know, there's certain things that need to be worked out. I went to the administration myself and had him pulled to my cell because I seen something in him. And what me and guys like Matt Hudson would try to do was, you try to teach the guys who's younger than you and let them lead, but make a fortress of support around them, because it allows them to be accountable. But on top of being accountable, it gives them the support where they have people they can ask questions to, and you give them the answer, but you still have to let them go forward. With me coming home, at first I seen a lot of people talking about COVID, and they was talking about, oh, this is like prison, this is that. And I laughed at first. But I have children and I live with my daughters. So I started seeing things that I seen in prison when people was in segregation, like boredom. So randomly saying bursts of things that could be taken any way, oversensitivity to things, because you don't really have nothing else to really pay attention to. So now you're on social media and you're seeing all these different things, or people are posting things as if they're doing something with their family. So it's like some children are single, they're by themselves. So they don't have siblings and all of that to be hanging out with. Their mother might be working, like still working. So they're literally by themselves, just looking at social media. Other parents doing TikTok videos and all these things, and this child feels left out, right? I don't particularly don't like that, but my daughter made me do TikTok videos, and it was something that I was able to bond with her for. So I look really stiff dancing, but I did it, right? I think that a lot of the times, because I know this, we ain't gonna make this about this the prison thing, because this is about the youth. I was a youth. I was locked up at 17 years old. You know, my father was gone. My mother was, you know, dealing with alcoholism and a lot of other stuff. Me and her got kidnapped when I was a child, and she was raped in front of me. So since that happened, things have never been the same in our life. And when it comes to me, I always took on a role where I was going to protect and support all of my family. I was that little girl taking care of the little 9-month baby, but I was taking care of 4 children until I got the courage to tell my grandmother, no one's here. And I don't know what to do at this point. I've been stealing food and bringing it home. I've been stealing bikes and selling the bikes to the older guys who were buying from me. But now I don't know what else to do. It's wintertime. So, you know, she brought me in it, and actually we started coming up and raising me. But that did something to me. And then coming home, if you don't know how to educate your loved ones how to love you, then you're not going to be able to be successful out here. And a lot of us don't have that, right? And I'm feeling like my daughter's doing schoolwork now. She wanted to jump on here so bad just to say hi, but she's literally doing school. She's in dance right now as we speak. And I feel like a lot of these kids are some of her friends. They don't have parents who will sit down with them and go over the curriculums with them when the TV's off. So now what happens when they're talking to the teacher now and they feel stupid, and the teacher's saying, well, you're not saying anything, so I'm gonna call you out or whatever. There has to be something implemented so that these kids after class can still have access to some of these teachers, and teachers have a crazy hectic job, but things like that needs to happen.
No, I appreciate, wow, you just, you said you heard a lot from us. We just received a lot from you right there, from both you and Jermaine. Thank you both. And I did say structural inequities, so that does include mass incarceration and our foster care system and ICE. And I'm so struck by, and thank you for your courage and your transparency and the story you shared about the trauma that happened within your family, and then what you did to survive. And I wanted to hold space for that because Ruth, as you so often say, no one raises a murderer. I don't think, any parent sets out to raise a child to commit crimes, but he was stealing bikes and selling them to make money to take care of his younger siblings. And so again, in terms of structural inequities and other social determinants, again, housing, food insecurity, alcoholism, sexual violence, all these things are interconnected. Bethany, I do want to bring you in here because you raised a point, and Ruth hit on it a little bit in terms of DV. We know we've seen an increase in suicide attempts and substance use and domestic violence. And you were just bringing up children who are, because of the pandemic, at home and are in danger and perhaps being abused or neglected. And there are limited vehicles in terms of reporting, and so could you just speak to that, and not only just doubling down on and elucidating the problem, but how could we, in the midst of COVID, what should the response look like? What would be helpful to make sure that these children are not in harm's way?
Sure, thank you so much, Congresswoman. In my work as an attorney representing children and families, sorry about the noise, and care and protection cases, a lot of the reports to the Department of Children and Families really did come from mandated reporters, whether it were the school teachers or guidance counselors, adults who were seeing these children. And because the children are at home, and as someone who suffered abuse and neglect in my home, I can only imagine what it would have been like if I didn't have a teacher who saw cigarette burns or bruises on my body and said, oh no, we need to intervene. So I know these children are suffering, and there's some serious trauma that is trauma on top of trauma. And I'm still dealing with the trauma related to that. But I feel like without the interventions or adults to see these children, because they're learning remotely, I imagine that the numbers will rise. I did reach out to a colleague who still practices in these cases and just wanted to find out, have the numbers gone up? But with courts sort of not being in session and everything being done remotely, I just don't imagine that our children are being served in abuse and neglect cases as much as they would be. I think a potential solution is maybe putting some money towards a public awareness campaign, sort of like a hotline for young people that's very like child friendly, saying, are you being abused? If this is happening, if you're being touched, or if you're being, left at home for hours, whatever it might be, so that the young people can call. Maybe it's on a social media platform that they view often, or something that BPS promotes, or on the public broadcast, whatever stations these young people are watching, so that they know that there is someone that they could call just to talk about, I'm dealing with abuse and neglect. And before I jump, if I might, Congresswoman, I wanted to just touch on the question that you will pose around which models or approaches are working. So as someone who ended up in the care and protection of a DCF, it was DSS then, for most of my young life into my adult life, I signed myself over into college. I think what kept me stable, especially around school, after being moved to 16 different placements and 5 different high schools, was a faith-based organization called the Boston Urban Youth Foundation, which is no longer in existence, but it really provided mentorship, advocacy, took us on college tours, a lot of what we modeled Girls Rule after, except gender-specific programming, I think in particular, is very important for young people experiencing trauma in the inner city. So that's the gap that we sought to fill. And some of the resources that we need more of is, well, one, we're deeply underfunded. Sharice Perry and I are co-directors of Girls Rule. And thanks to you, Congresswoman, during your tenure as city councilor at large, that we received, in-kind donations and support of strong women like you as role models. We're not, service providers per se, we just wanted to give back. So having experience, people with lived experience and people of the community serving in these roots organizations is helpful, but also again, the money. And then also more of these organizations. So in my tenure as an attorney practicing in these cases, we needed more than the bigger organizations like Artists for Humanities or YMCA to refer young people to. So we needed more Girls Rules and more gender specific programming. I think there's like MBK 617. There's so many folks from the community who are trying to do this work, and we're connected to these young people. They trust us. They still call us. They still call you. They still call Liz Miranda and say, I need help. We need to move to another unit. They call us for everything. Housing, job support, and so we're really
I got you. No, I appreciate that. And I think there's two issues on the funding side in terms of community-based organizations, is that those bigger, more iconic, conventional, traditional organizations who do incredible work, they're better positioned. A lot of them just get level funded just off, right away. That not to say that they're not going through a process and that sort of thing and lobbying for themselves, because they are, but because they are so well branded and so big, they're better positioned. And on the staffing level, they might also have grant writers and people that have the technical skills to pursue those things, and the smaller organizations don't. The other challenge I remember in my time on the council is that it seemed there were organizations that were not as proven, but kept getting funded. So maybe at one time they were very robust and they had the metrics of success and all those things to point to, but now it's just sort of assumed that they're still, I remember asking in a hearing some of these organizations, I teased out the difference between a contact and actually providing services, right? So, and you learn that there are organizations that are counting that they went to something and tabled and passed out a flyer to 300 people. That's contact. That is not service, right? So we have to ask those very specific questions. So also, Bethany, thank you for the transparency with which you share your own story. All of you seek to provide and to do what you didn't have, and you don't have to do that. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for your suggestion around the public awareness campaign and making sure that we don't lose sight of this form of trauma that is showing up and that is growing in the midst of this pandemic. And we have to address this funding situation. I sometimes I feel that we have too many organizations. Like in the Circle of Promise, there's something like 150 nonprofits. So I don't know if we have a lot of organizations that are doing duplicating, efforts, or that's a bigger issue to resolve, that we won't get to today. And I know that I have to jump for another thing, but
I was about to chime that. You have about 5 more minutes to just wrap up. And I know that Bethany has to jump, and Jermaine had his hand raised. So I don't know if you still wanted to touch upon that. And then I just want to remind you, you got like 5 more minutes.
Okay, before I have to jump for the next thing, I did want to, before we get to Jermaine, and then we'll just say thank you and wrap it up. And if there are any other things that folks want us to follow up on, you can drop it into the chat. Gladys, is there anything that you wanted to offer before we turn to Jermaine and close the meeting out?
No, I love where the conversation is going. I actually learned so much of other resources that I haven't tapped into, that I have to connect with some of the panelists. So I would love to have their contact information so that I can continue to learn more of what they're doing, so that I can connect our youth to them.
Excellent. Okay, folks, drop your information in the chat, and we'll also be doing follow-up emails. And so we'll do our best to keep you all connected. But again, thank you for what you're all doing. Okay, Jermaine? Any comments or recommendations?
I just kind of wanted to highlight it as well, that based off of my personal experience, what I've seen, like with my children in regards to COVID is their exposure due to we can't monitor everything they're exposed to, and in that regard, the trauma they receive. For example, my man, who it was obvious that he had suffered from mental health issues, and he was going into a fit, and when the police were called, he had a knife, and he unfortunately he lost his life. And I just feel like things like this it could have been so preventable, and there's not enough training.
I'm sorry, Jermaine, we can't hear you.
No, I can hear you, but you're just breaking up a little bit. So let me try to synopsize what I think you were saying. And that is that you said you can't monitor everything. And so there have been situations where youth were vulnerable, and one situation even resulted in a loss of life, but you believe that was something that could have been stopped. But there can't be an intervention because you can't monitor everything. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm sorry, your connection is breaking up for us. So, but as
and
I
on a
told
more
you,
personal level, we
yeah.
have one of our kids here at the gym just recently. It's been several reports. Can you hear me?
Jermaine, I'm so sorry because I know we need the benefit of what you're offering, and I do want to hear about your personal perspective. It's just the connection is very spotty, so you're going in and out. So I apologize for that. Do you want to write something in the chat? That would be very helpful.
Yeah, I sent him a direct message to write in the chat, but I see one of Keon's daughters. I think she want to say hi real quick.
Ah! Oh my goodness.
Hi.
You genius, you queen, you.
So cute.
Oh my goodness.
Okay,
So good to
Meja.
see you. I'm sorry to pull you from your schoolwork. I wish I could have seen you performing your dance.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some other time. Okay, thank you for popping in. And your dad, I hope you heard him. He did an extraordinary job.
Thank you.
Yeah, extraordinary job.
So great.
Okay, so thank you all. This has been tremendously informative, and I'll say as devastating as the situations that you all have centered in this conversation, it has also been equally inspiring because I do believe that these are things that there are solutions, and you've helped to really distill some of those for us, and we'll build upon the legislation we've already introduced. We'll continue to work with our state and municipal partners, and most importantly, continue to work with all of you. Aissa, Luz, is there anything that you wanted to offer as we wrap?
No, just thank you again so much to each and every one of you. And I know I didn't say this at the top, but I know we mostly represent in Boston right now, but we are multi-pronged people with families and work and in multiple spaces across the Commonwealth. So just thank you. And we know that the expertise you bring is not only your own, but those that you love and from your village. So thank you again.
And I just want to thank my team. I want to thank Aissa. I want to thank Jen. I want to thank Lou. This has been the Trinity that has made legislation possible, and certainly the work that Luz has been doing on the ground. We just celebrated Luz's birthday, and I said that she is a seeker, that she is a doer, and she is a healer. And we appreciate you so much. And Jen has been working with, if she hasn't already, with many of you, but also many in public health to help to write our bill. So I want to make sure you all can see Jen. And then Aissa Conchola, who is wearing
La Jefa.
Ayanna Pressley sweatshirt, Policy is My Love Language. She is my legislative director, and I'm so fortunate that I have a team that makes it possible for me to actualize our values and to make good on the promises that I made when I was running for this seat. So thank you, everyone. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Congresswoman, I do have to get you to your next appointment. So
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
This has been incredible. Thank you.
What's up, folks? You still around?